So, hello guys, welcome to our podcast, The Debate. Our topic for today will be intercultural communication, and our panelists, as always, are Mia Cadauan, Marcos Solano, and Zanaya Singson. How are y'all doing?
I'm alright.
Alright, so let's get right into the topic of intercultural communication. Any thoughts, concerns, postulations, or insights you can give about the subject we'll be talking about today?
So when we talk about intercultural communication, this obviously refers to communication between two or more groups coming from unique backgrounds. Differences can include economic status, ethnicity, even things like sexuality and religion can be determining factors to determine communication as intercultural.
Same here. Of course, but there's even more than just that. There are the subcultures na also involved, halimbawa na lang natin ang culture ng bansa. Of course, there is the Filipino culture as a whole, pero nag-iiba ang kultura base sa kung saang relihiyon kagaling. Ang evidence nito is the cuisine. It is not. Perhaps, those around here in Isabela might not like certain exotic item like durian, pero in Davao, they have it everywhere.
But how much is too much as far as that goes? Like, we can say that there will always be subcultures and microcultures, but there's a point where it isn't just simply culture, it's just being unique to a certain group. For example, your family dynamic could be a different family dynamic than mine, but that doesn't exactly mean that they're cultures. And before we broach the topic of single-parent households or the standard nuclear household and how that in of itself can also be interpreted as a culture, what I refer to specifically is things that are just habitual behaviors that are just minuscule. It can be really just the smallest things, like how you wash the dishes or how you haggle for lower prices. Really just small things, like it can be anything really, like the smallest habitual behaviors, like, you know, talking loudly with your hands, expressing loudly with your hands, or, you know, just stroking your cheek every so often. Like, those are the sort of small behaviors, right?
Nakikita ko ang punto mo, Lance. But nowadays, even the menial, trivial behavior can themselves be culture. Why? Because these things are expedited now to the greater globe itself. Whenever may nag-post na ganito, ang ginagawa nila for this chore or that, people who also do the same will respond, and so that within itself becomes a culture.
Is this really true? Culture entails experiences and privileges as well as difficulties that face you. Ibig sabihin nun ay may mga bagay talagang belong lang sa isang group or demographic. They can be defining and influencing what is being said about those micro behaviors is that they are just small things.
Okay, precisely my point. But anyway, let's not get too carried away with the topic of culture and how to define it. If there's a need for clarification, let's get responses from people with broader or different perspectives. Basically, we rounded up a group of foreigners and asked them some interviewing questions about their opinions on culture and intercultural communication. Here are the questions we asked them. Number 1, where are you from? In other words, where do you currently live? And if you've immigrated, where did you used to live? Number 2, how would you define culture? Furthermore, how would you define your culture? Number 3, are there different layers to your culture? Example being a part of an ethnic group. If so, does this influence or change parts of your predefined culture? Number 4, is there any insights or interesting things you've learned when speaking with people from other cultures? And number 5, is communicating with people from other cultures easy or difficult? Explain how you feel. The first interviewee goes by the name Sumi. Number 1, Singapore, never immigrated. Number 2, what I would define culture is basically passed down traditions adapted to the modern world, which is segregated by either race or religion or both. Number 3, since I lived with a very open-minded family and have relatives from nearly all ethnic groups, I never really experienced any different layers. Nothing regarding my culture has affected me other than the race I identify myself under and my given name. Number 4. The differences in practices others have or things others do because of their culture. Number 5. It's easy, but sometimes culture comes with its own set of problems, like the language barrier or not noticing the sensitivity of certain subjects. I don't really feel much about it, just think it's interesting how different people can be, though slight embarrassment is felt when mistakes have been unknowingly and accidentally made. Our next interviewee goes by the name Celestia. Number 1. I was born and raised in Britain. Number 2 to 3. Culture. I would define culture as part of your identity since it intertwines with your family background, inheritance, where you grew up, the people you associate yourself with, etc. Like for example, my parents and family are from Pakistan, while my sister and I grew up here. We have different beliefs, values, habits, etc., especially in our way of thinking and views. However, I think I do incorporate some of my Pakistani culture to myself. Number 4. I would say I have since some things I do that I learned from my culture doesn't happen in others, especially thought process about different topics. Number 5. Communicating with other cultures can go both ways for me, at least. Some cultures are, in a way, stuck back in the old days, old way of thinking, if that makes sense. Some cultures are more open-minded. I see myself getting along with the latter more because, from my experience, some cultures won't let things go when I don't want to get into an argument about it. Our next interviewee goes by the name Cade. Number 1. I currently live within a medium-sized town in New York, not in New York City though. Number 2. I would define culture as to be the current customs. Example being 20th century pop culture, specific gaming or art cultures included to that. It would be the same if I were to explain my culture. Number 3. No, for mine, I don't belong in anything that would revolve around my culture. Number 4. Sadly enough, I never really spoke to others about their cultures or have done research on what could be other country/city cultures. Number 5. I believe it to be difficult, as majority of the world aren't really interested in talking one's culture about themselves or friends. Although the topic is relatively important, not a lot of people speak to everyone about it, making it a difficult topic to even be brought up to those nearby or those across the country. Our last interviewee goes by the name Marianne. Number 1. I'm from the Philippines. Number 2. Culture is what defines us as, well, us. It shows our values, heritage, etc. Our culture, I can say it's unique as it is influenced by multiple Western countries with a spice of Asian influence. Number 3. As far as I'm aware of, there aren't really any layers. Number 4. Well, all I can say is that people whom I've spoken to, mostly Americans, have better learning opportunities. Number 5. Honestly, that depends with the person you're speaking with. There are times that I can vibe with someone, while others just, especially if they're stubborn with their beliefs. Now, back to the podcast. So, getting back on track, let me share some of my thoughts with intercultural communication. During earlier years of my life, I was in the highly lucky position of living in another country and not only experiencing Australian culture, but also the cultures of the greater ecosystem, so to speak, or the ethnicities within Australia. Because there were a lot of immigrants and a lot of people who moved to Australia back then. It's a first world country as far as first world countries go. So there are people that go to Australia to live a better life there. So I got to experience a lot of cultures. I got to experience Muslim culture. I got to experience Pakistani culture, Malaysian culture, Nepalese culture, and I got to experience all of these different cultures, the cultures of Australians, the cultures of their indigenous people, the Aboriginals. And I got to learn about it when I talked to these people, when I became friends with them. I learned what they did, and during maybe like I can't remember which months specifically, but it was around Christmas or rather a couple months before Christmas, and Ramadan came, and no one would be at school. No, none of my Muslim friends would be at school. None of my Muslim classmates would be at school. And so that's culture, right? And though it might have been skewed, my perception, because I was just a child, there's still a lot of learning to be done, right? But still, at least I have that background, right? And they share our values. It is basically the thing I'm trying to say here. They share our values of family, of cleanliness, of that sort of thing, right? And they have unique perspectives on issues that maybe we need to explore or we haven't considered, because we only have a single face on the issue, or single faces on almost every issue, right? So when you talk to other people who come from different backgrounds, they'll also have different sorts of views. And that's a thing to gain, right? Because when you communicate with other people from other cultures and get that sort of exchange of communication, it's very important and it's very nice, because you're getting a perspective that your family wouldn't even be able to give. You're getting a perspective that is unique to them because it's unique to their culture. But more than that, it's not only unique to the individual and their sorts of values, but it's also unique as in a divide between the cultures. Because my culture and their culture are massively different, right? So with that sort of exchange, you get an idea or an opinion that you might not have had before. And yeah, they gave me deep, thought-provoking concepts, even at a young age. Because one of my neighbors, he was probably 2 houses down, because we lived at the corner, right? So his house was also a corner house, and basically he was my neighbor, and he was a refugee from the, a bunch of Middle Eastern disputes. I can't quite remember where he was from. I would say Persia, or I guess it's Syria now. But he didn't speak any English, but what he had to offer in terms of perspective was really beautiful and thought-provoking.
Of course, they have something to offer that we would never fluently comprehend. It came from a Wharton area. It's reminiscent of certain events that transpired here even.
Actually, you said that hindi siya nagsasalita ng English or nahihirapan siya magsalita ng English. So how did you communicate? How did you exchange ideas and concepts? How did you become friends? Sa akin lang, medyo mahirap yan. Yung hindi mo siya makausap kapag. It's the same as Japanese person speaking to the German person, such a distinct different that it seems difficult for them to actually conduct communication.
Kaya nga, when you think about communication, it is verbal exchange, in fact, even through non-verbal communication and action which depict exact one-to-one equivalence. How can your communication happen? Let me rephrase, how can you say there's changing of vital concept when such topic will be clearly difficult to give and receive when using first-level vernacular?
Of course, as kids, there's no such thing as a lesson of comprehensive vocabulary which you can use to supplement every piece of your speech to give the precise meaning of your intended message. In fact, even if there was, there's still a cultural difference and religious difference, as well as backgrounds and different upbringings and all of those sorts of different elements and that come into it, right? those different types of noises that interfere, right? But even with the perfect language used, you can't always get the perfect interpretation because people are unique. And there, even if you use the most precise language, the most coded, exact language, you can't quite say that it's always going to be the perfect language for the individual, for the person. So it can't be said that it would be able to happen with perfect language. So how did we communicate? If they couldn't speak much English and I didn't understand his language, well, of course, first things first, he did speak like basic English. He spoke like, you know, he knew the basic words that would be useful, right? And I'm sure now he's probably more eloquent than me. But we talked not through just words, we talked through games and expressions. We maybe we weren't detective level reading each other, but you could see on someone's face if they were happy or not. That's just common sense. So we talked through those expressions of happiness or distaste or excitement or exhilaration. You know, you could be separated from one pole to the other, right? But you still laugh the same. You just laugh the same. There's no differentiating a laugh. And we talked through games and expressions and basic words and, you know, first level vernacular. There was no need to talk about, you know, like the political state of their homeland or how, you know, Americans coming into their country is disrupting everything, or there was no need to talk about like semantics or politics. There was no need to talk about how they felt or their uncertainties or, you know, their regrets. We were just kids after all, but more than that, you don't need to communicate that to get an exchange of values, an exchange of information. Because even if you're from a different country, there's still something you can give. There's something here that you can give to the person before you. There's something here that you can give. There's information that you can give, and it's up to the other person to pick it up. And so we used to play a game. It's called handball, if you know what it is. Basically, you have a bouncy ball. It isn't really played here in the Philippines. But you have a bouncy ball. There are 4 squares. And you would basically... It's like tennis. You hit it on your court, and it bounces to the other person's court. And they hit it back. And it's a simple game. It's a fun, active game. And ultimately, it's what we connected over. Because, you know, first things first, we're both immigrants. My brother and I were immigrants of a different nature because we didn't just move in. We didn't not know the language. We originally came from New Zealand, so we picked it up quite quickly because when we moved, we were only like, what, 4 or something. And so, of course, you just pick it up like that. English is just easy, essentially. But, you know, there was no need to talk about intricacies of culture. And there was just an exchange by physical expression. By playing that game, you get that exchange. You get an exchange that's worth more than, to me, worth more than just arbitrarily talking about whatever and whatever. Like, it's an experience of a different person's perspective that you don't usually get. So, communication, what I'm trying to say is communication between culture isn't just about exchanging ideas about culture. That's not, you know, what communication is. Communication doesn't revolve around a topic. Communication just happens. It happens when you speak. And it just happens, right? Intercultural communication, when you're speaking to someone from a different culture, it just happens. So what we get out of it is, what we get out of the communication is indicative or representative of the personal biases of of ourselves. Like, we could have a disagreement about what the best instrument is, right? And when we speak, that can be exchanged, right? So that is already representative of your innate biases. So, but above all else, what intercultural communication actually teaches you is that regardless of your background, you can ultimately get together still and exchange communication. Because communication isn't just verbal. It's nonverbal, as we've mentioned. It's nonverbal, and it can be expressive even without verbal communication. Just using my hands, I'm already supplementing what I'm saying. And, supplementing what I'm saying just by moving my hands. And what more if we're engaging in an activity together? That's already a cultural exchange. We're doing something together. We're initiating in an activity that, people of the same culture will still be able to communicate and do it while doing the task. But there's a certain level when you initiate activities with someone from a different culture. There's a certain different experience that you can get. There's a certain different aspect that you can capture out of the experience. Now, regardless of their culture or where they come from, ultimately you just have that sort of exchange. And communication doesn't revolve around eloquent messages or deep conversations or thought-provoking or profound conversations. Communication at its core is just expressing of messages, expressing of intent and want, and communicating ideas and messages. And you don't need to communicate an idea by speaking. You can just communicate. I can just communicate to you with my expression. I can just communicate with my hands, with my facial expression, with my body and my hands and my face. All of it can be used to communicate. And just because the regular mode of communication is through your voice doesn't mean that communication ceases when you don't use it. And when you're a kid, you don't realize that, right? You're just having fun. But now, when you learn these concepts, you realize that it isn't just, talking to someone. It isn't just doing this or that with them. You're communicating in a way that isn't traditional. It isn't like regular, but you're still communicating. And if you can just get information out of it, that's already communication. In the end, though, even if you try to analyze it or look deep into it, at its core, it's just a couple of kids having fun in a game. And, that's all you need. That's all you need to understand from it. And what those kids got out of that situation, well, that's the message, that's the intent that they got. And that's how you can tell that intercultural communication succeeded.
So given that, let's think about how intercultural communication is used nowadays, perhaps specifically in the Philippines.
Well, alam niyo ba ang kwento ng town mouse and city mouse? They are related but came from different environments. And when they communicate, there is obviously a difference in how they speak and how they react in different things.
So, even the difference between two backgrounds can influence the culture? No. But aside from the example of people from the province going to a major city or vice versa, there's intercultural communication that happens when foreigners and tourists come to our country. And of course, the inverse is also true. Our OFWs experience different culture too. And evidence of this is Lance right, but I think we would be remiss if we miss out of that topic of racism or prejudice. On occasion, OFWs can experience spells of racism and harassment from people they don't know. So it must be problem, no.
Of course, we breached the topic of racism, prejudice, and that. And it is true, there are racists and prejudiced people out there. Like, you can't stop someone from having personal biases, and you can't stop someone from having innate opinions and preconceived notions about you and your people, right? That's just impossible. And a highlight of this was during the span of the pandemic, because we've seen the tragic loss of George Floyd during the pandemic, of course, and he was yelling out, "I can't breathe." And as the police officer stood over him, it was clear then that this was an act of racism. And, you know, during the whole pandemic, Asians got harassed in first world countries based on the color of their skin. This was mostly in America because Americans were influenced by a certain person, but people were being harassed, and sad to say, probably OFWs too. And it's sad, but it's the reality until it changes. And I say until it changes because we can't control how people interpret us. And what I mean by that is someone's interpretation of you can be totally different from who you are. And you can present yourself as best as you possibly can. You can dress up in your nicest suit and tie. You can look to be the smartest person on earth. You can be as neatly dressed as you can. You can try not to wear any Filipino apparel, any Asian apparel, any Asian or Asian representing identity on yourself to try and say, "Oh, look at me, I'm just like you." But in the end, that doesn't mean they'll accept you. Racism, it's so hard because it's so deeply ingrained in someone to be racist. And you can do everything you can to try and rewrite that. You can do everything you can to be as nice as you can, to be as open as you can, to be as thick-skinned as you can. But when someone is racist and they've already grown up being a racist, there's really quite a difficulty to try and circumvent that, to try and stop it again, to try and make them reconsider, because when you've gone that far down, it's almost at a point where whatever you do, it doesn't really matter. So it's important for it to be nipped at the bud. And, you know, when I was schooling, this happened. So it happened once when one of my classmates, he was an older classmate. The thing about the school I was at was it was kind of co-grade. So like grade 1 and 2 would be together, grade 3 and 4 would be together, 5 and 6 would also be together sharing the same space. So he was my elder classman, so to speak, and he was from the Middle East. I think it was Lebanon. He was from Lebanon, and I can't remember now, but he said a racial comment about Asians, right? And one of my teachers, her name is Hannah, she went up to him at that time because she heard that racial comment, and she nipped it at the bud to make sure that he was aware that his comments aren't exactly just jokes. They're not just offhanded remarks. They're not just these, jokes. They're not just jipes. They're not just, jabs. They're not simple pranking, sort of joking remarks. They can actually be hurtful. And when you nip it at the bud like that, then you communicate that it's not okay. But what we see when we see racism is it happens usually with older people. Older people are usually more racist. And of course, this isn't just mutually exclusive, and there are all types of racism. There are all types of grades and levels. But like when you see like the hardest, the most harshest, most deprivating, most deprecating, most depriving language and slurs, it usually comes from the older generation, and it does hurt, our people, our workers, these people are family members, their mothers, their fathers, and they sometimes it just happens that they get racially attacked. Maybe not always physically, verbally, yeah, but it's hard to stop it from happening because you're going over to the other country, and of course there's no justification for it to happen, but all you can do is try to advocate for it to stop. And of course, just because it happens overseas doesn't mean that we also have our form of racism, so to speak. For example, business owners upselling towards foreign customers. That is what I would consider a form of racism. You're exploiting someone else off the knowledge that they have more money. That's, oh look, that person's white. He's probably got more money, so, make him pay more. And that to me isn't right. And in terms of intercultural communication, what it does is, first, it stereotypes people. So you already have this preconceived notion about someone before you even talk to them. And so having that preconceived notion alters the conversation. It doesn't make it as true. It doesn't make it as, common or good as it could be, because you're communicating, right? And trying to get out this communication when you're not actually like communicating well, because inside you're already having this notion that they're this sort of person. Well, that skews what you think about them. That skews what you interpret from what they say. So you already have a dishonest conversation. You already have a dishonest communication. Even though it is still communication, it's dishonest. So there's a requirement, or rather, to me, it feels like there should be an open-mindedness. And a willingness not to exploit, a willingness not to think, oh, that person probably has a lot of money, because that's not right.
There is something to said about how intellectual communication can be a beautiful thing. Dahil sa intellectual communication, more people are becoming aware and open-minded towards different cultures. And because of the internet, this connection and understanding can be established at the quicker rate than ever before.
Compare that to the time before where the only way to experience different culture was to have the funds necessary. Think about Sir Jose Rizal and his globe-trotting, or even you were with Raul Contreras and Johnny Antillon, students from the Philippines who got to experience different culture through an exchange program, who formed beautiful opinion on a variety of topics.
For posterity's sake, Raul Contreras again is a student who attended the student exchange program, and on numerous occasions, he represented his country in the best way possible. Is that not correct?
On the topic of Raul Contreras, this has been like a topic that I really like, because I've been watching, some of his videos from before, and I really like, that whole... I like his accent. I like, how he spoke. He was very verbose in his speaking. He was very good at articulating his words, right? And I think when you have these cultural exchanges, it gives people the chance to, to understand you. But I think, nowadays, when it comes to intercultural communication, you don't have the same conversations that Raul Contreras used to have, and his peers, because back then those things were televised, because strictly speaking they were the only chances people got to see these representations and see these thoughts. Nowadays we have the internet, and with the internet there's quite literally there's no end to what you can do. There's no end to how you can communicate with other people. Like in the messenger space alone, you already have friends of friends of friends of friends who you can talk to, if you want to do that even. But like on different apps, it's even more international. You can talk to people you don't even know, people from other countries. There are apps called like Omegle, where these people are from England, they're from the United States, they're from the Netherlands, they're from Germany, they're from Angola, they're from Niger, they're from Georgia, they're from all these different places, and you can already have an intercultural discussion with them. You can already have this communication because it's through the internet. Through the internet, you can get these conversations. You can get, these communications without needing to have stepped outside of your house. You don't need to get outside, or you don't need to move to a different country even to communicate, to get this communication. And I think, as Mia said, it proves that there is beauty, right? Because when you have these conversations happening, negative impact or not, it's still communication. It still gives a message, and hopefully it's a good message. I hope, because it gives our people a more positive representation, and I think that's good. I think all people deserve good representation. I think all people deserve to be thought of in a positive light. But when we have these sorts of communications between people who are not familiar with our culture or who we are, it broadens their horizons. It gives them a perspective that isn't often seen. And that's why communication is so beautiful. And I think that's all we have time for. So thank you for listening to our brief podcast. And yeah, thank you. That's exactly why I have disdain for Filipino culture. Because Filipino culture is lazy. They commit to doing literally the bare minimum because of whatever reason they can come up with. I'm not saying that Filipinos aren't studious, aren't diligent. There are a lot of people from a lot of different countries that are the same in being diligent, being studious, and being not so much. But I feel like Filipinos have this sort of culture, or maybe it's just a whole group of people where they just want to commit to doing the bare minimum. Why do the bare minimum? Why not try? And if you fail, if you embarrass yourself, that's fine because you did the best you could do and you did it. So don't be embarrassed because you did something and you did it to the best of your ability. No one's going to laugh at you for that. No one. Why would they? Who are they to laugh at you? You did the best you could do, so why? Don't hinder yourself because you're worried that someone else might think this way or that. Just do the best you can do and you'll get a result. And it doesn't matter if it's the best result or the worst result in the world. You did the best you could do. You did what you could achieve. And that in of itself should be a point of pride.